focus I want to work on right now is the introduction to the short story analysis. And you have other videos that talk about moving into the body and talking about the conclusion. Those are things that are going to be important. But for this one, I just want to talk about the introduction. Now, one of the things that goes on with any introduction, no matter what type of essay it is the introduction sets up what you're going to do, a basic approach you're going to take. So no matter how many different variations on that there are, that's the number one thing you're going to think about. What are you doing? What are you going to set up? Okay. Now, for the short story analysis, we have this introduction, and I want to go straight to the basic discussion here. The introduction is to an essay, and the essay is about a topic. Okay, the topic is in your title, but it's also going to be something you're going to mention in the introduction. So I want to look first at the title. With the short story analysis, sometimes people have trouble figuring out what a title should be. And for this title, all you need to do is name the theme and the title of the work you're talking about. So you also want to notice that it's Araby is in quotation marks, and that's because Araby is the title of the story inside my title. I don't have quotation marks around my title, but I have quotation marks around the story of any title I'm doing. Or when we go to the Marrow Thieves, or we go to any novel analysis, we're going to have that title in italics. So if there's more than one title, your title and the other title, you indicate the other title by quotation marks or italics, in this case, quotation marks. Now I want to look at this first introductory paragraph and talk about how this develops. And the short story in any short story analysis or any essay in general, your first paragraph is just part of a statement, explanation, example pattern, or the C pattern. You make a statement of what the theme is, and then you declare how important that theme is and how it develops, right? So let's read this paragraph, then go back through it systematically. James Joyce's Araby is controlled by the theme of futility. At every point in the story, the narrator's hopes for life are shown to be futile. He wants to achieve the love, or at least get the interest of Mangan's sister by getting her gift from the Araby fair. That dream is futile from the outset, considering she is around 17 and he is around 13. He is also hopeless on broader and deeper levels. His family life, his Catholic faith, and not least of all the town of Dublin combine to sum up every aspect of his existence in the final desperate words of the story. Gazing up in the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. So I want to start off with the first promise we make. The first promise I make in this is I'm going to talk about futility. That's my theme. That's what's going to be important in this story. So futility is an especially important idea. I've declared it's going to be important by talking about it in my introduction. Okay. Then I want to look at the basic promise of set of promises of the introduction, which is not only here's my theme, but in my statement, explanation, example pattern, I'm going to show the basic ways I'm going to talk about that theme. Now, I don't want to make it seem like a pure formula, because all you're really doing in this opening paragraph is thinking on the page. You're saying, here's my theme. Here's how I think it goes. I want to repeat, here's how I think it goes, because very often people in their introductions have a hard time figuring out what to do because they don't know yet exactly what they're going to say. Now, that is not a deal breaker, because for one thing, you have computers. You can redo this introduction if you do something different in the body than you do in the introduction. No problem at all. But what I want you to do with any sort of introduction, starting with your short story analysis, is make a guess of what you think. And the way you do that is you take a look at the whole story and say, all these different details, all the things that have happened, what do they add up to me? And why do they add up to that? Okay, what is the number one thing that I think about it? And why do I think about this? So you're going to think around, you're going to look around the details and say, what do all these details mean? So here I start with futility. Futility is going to be my theme. And I'm going to explain how futility happens. At every point in the story, the narrator's hopes for life are shown to be futile. I'm not worried about using the word again. I can overuse it, but that's not usually the problem. Usually the problem is that people forget about the word that they were talking about, or they forget about the theme they're going to talk about. You're going to go forward on this theme. So futility is my theme. Now I'm going to go in this paragraph, I'm going to think around that theme. And I'm going to think about all the different ways, without mentioning any specific details, unless they're really important, I'm going to talk about what is the way that futility happens. Now, this is partly a matter of classifying. What are the different ways that futility happens? What are the different ways it doesn't work? Okay, so one thing that's going to show futility is Mang and sister. Okay, another is Araby fair. In this sense, I have these two things. Now, these two things are related because in the story, the narrator wants to go to Araby fair to impress Mang and sister. Okay, since he's 17 and he's 13, I don't like his odds unless there's something very much wrong with this girl. Nothing is going to happen with this. Okay, and that's part of what the futility of the story is, how this kid, okay, 12 or 13 years old, we don't have an exact age, has fallen this crush on this girl, and like most crushes, it will end embarrassingly. Okay, so we have these different things. Then we're going to explain his family life, his Catholic faith, and Dublin. These are ways that futility demonstrates. Now, I want you to notice at this point, everything I've got highlighted in yellow is something I'm implicitly promising that I'm going to talk about later. And because I promised I'm going to talk about it later, I've done what I call giving myself room to write into, So, for example, if you're playing a sport, you make the pass where you want the person to be. I'm doing that for myself. I want to talk about these things that are derived in general from the specific things that I've noticed in the story. Okay, so I'm going to work with those. Now, the last thing I want you to notice for this paragraph before we go into how this develops in the body is I've done something here you do not have to do. I've quoted at the end, gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. Now, when he talks about vanity, he's using vanity in a way that we don't anymore. Okay. It's talking about vanity as doing something in vain. In other words, futility, uselessness. So throughout this essay, I've got futility. I'm going to look for words like worthless, useless, vain, any number of things that indicate that what he wants to do or what he thinks he is, or even what he is useless, right? So I've got this in place. Now, I've quoted this, and the reason I've quoted this last ending of the story is because everything in the story leads up to that. Everything in the story is in some way like going around this like a hub. That isn't the case for every story. And the three stories we have in the short story analysis section, none of them leads up to a last sentence of the paragraph of the story that's everything is going around. So you don't need to do this. In fact, I'm going to suggest in your first paragraph, don't quote it all. Okay, save the quoting for the body. Okay. So I have this, and I want to notice that the first thing I talk about here is going to be drawn from one or more of these promises I made in the introduction. And the first one here is the town of Dublin. Everything is in Dublin. And this is something that is going to come directly from what I talked about. Okay. What I talked about here. Okay. I mentioned Dublin in my introduction. I'm going to mention Dublin again at the beginning. Okay. Now, it may be I may talk about these items in the order. In this case, I'm not. I'm just going with Dublin. That's the first thing I'm going to talk about. That's something that's going to be important. It's something that I'm going to write about. Now, in the overall process of the story, what you're doing is you're developing a basic pattern where you're going to talk about things in the story. And I want you to deal with this reality that you're basically talking about things in the story in the order they happen. Now, at the front of this line is the first thing that happens in the story. At the end of the line is the second thing that happens in the story. Okay. Now, one of the things you want to avoid in your short story analysis is plot summary. You analyze, don't summarize. Analyze, don't summarize. So the difference between analysis and summary is summary tells us what happens. Analysis tells what it means for your theme. Okay. So the assumption you have for the short story analysis is that the reader has read the story. If I have not read Cathedral, why would I be interested in an essay on blindness in Cathedral? Okay. It's part of matter of your audience. So you're not committed to talking about every event. You're committed to talking about only the events that relate to your theme. So in this particular case, the first event in the story relates to my theme. So I'm going to quote from the very start of the story. Okay. But it's entirely possible you may have an event where the theme starts toward the end of the story. For example, if you talk about the theme of pot use in pot smoking in cathedral, you're going to talk about something fairly far along in the story, which means that all of this you don't have to worry about. You're just going to go to this point. So in this case, the first event is going to talk about it. Then what I want you to notice is from that point forward, I'm basically going to events that relate to my theme. If it relates to my theme, I talk about it. If it doesn't relate to my theme, I don't talk about it. Okay. Now, the first principle you want to work with on this, and remember when you go into the body, is what I call look back, step forward. And what that means is with every example, you're looking back at examples you talked about before, and you're looking back at the introduction. So let me put that. Back at and connect the introduction. Let's spell introduction correctly. And any previous examples. So when I'm doing this, okay, what I may have happen, and in all likelihood I will have, I'm looking back at the introduction. Every example I list has to have something to do with the introduction, or it doesn't belong in the essay. But it also may relate to the first example. Okay. So let's skip forward here. Let's talk about third or fourth example. With my third example, I'm tying it back to the introduction, but I may tie it back if it relates to this example, or I may connect it to this example. So let's say we go farther in the essay. I'm thinking about how this connects to the introduction, but I'm also explicitly tying it to any other previous examples. So what I want you to think about for any essay is the reality that with every example, you have more to potentially talk about, because example 4 may relate directly to example 3 in a way you need to explain. If so, explain it. That's what you're doing when you're analyzing, is you're explaining connections that you've made. Example 2 may relate to example 1, but it will relate to the introduction. So you're never at any point in an essay flying blind. You're always flying by the light of what you said in the introduction, and you're flying by the light of the examples you said before. If you use these methods, if you use look back, step forward, and if you tie it back explicitly and implicitly to the example you talked about in the introduction, you should be fine. You should be going places, and the places should be good. Okay, I'll see you